Be a lovely discussion. So hello everyone, and welcome to the World Press Freedom Day panel discussion. My name is Angad, and I'm the head of advancement at UWC Mahindra College. International days and weeks are occasions to educate ourselves on issues of concern, to mobilize political will and resources to address global problems, and to celebrate and reinforce achievements of humanity. At MUWCI, we see World Press Freedom Day as an opportunity to celebrate the fundamental principles of press freedom and to assess the state of press freedom throughout the world. We will be covering some of these topics in today's discussion. Now, although this session is being recorded on the 28th, we will be posting it to the college's social media handles on the 3rd of May, which is World Press Freedom Day. So with that brief context, let's get started. With me today, I have two first-year students who will be facilitating the discussions. We have Vani Mishra from India and Amani Jamil from Bangladesh. We will start with brief introductions from the students and panelists for about 10 minutes, following which we will go into a few structured questions for 30 minutes before opening up the last 10 minutes for questions from the audience. Thank you to our panelists, Saim, Zahina, and Chahat for agreeing to join us today, and to all of you that have tuned in. I hope you have a lovely evening, and I will now pass on to Vani and Amani.
Hi, I'm Amani. I'm from Bangladesh, and I'm a global politics student. So as part of the IB, we have this activity called engagement activity where we have to act like journalists. And I also just have a general affinity towards journalism. So obviously when I got the chance, when I was come with the chance to facilitate a panel with all these incredible people, I was very excited.
Hi guys, I'm Vani. I'm from Punjab and Bihar, two states in India. My only experience with press is when I would go to debate competitions, and we would have a committee of press members, journalists basically, and we would all debate and talk about topics like yellow journalism, clickbait, press freedom and stuff like that. And then we would run around this whole debate competition interviewing people and sit down and write down whatever we explored. We would make a newspaper and stuff like that. So yeah, and I'm so excited to be with this meeting.
So our first panelist is Chahat Rana from India, who is currently a public health reporting fellow at the Caravan. In the last 2 years, she has reported on the COVID-19 crisis in depth from multiple perspectives. She has graduated from MUWCI in 2015 and went to study English and journalism at Ashoka University. Her reporting, which has appeared in the Indian Express, The Wire, and The Print as well, has covered topics like policy, pop culture, and politics.
Next up, we have Saim Saeed from Pakistan. He is currently an assistant tech editor with Politico Europe. Saim is from MUWCI's class of 2009. As one of the few Pakistani students to have attended MUWCI, Saim has many insights into the conflict between the two nations and how it plays out in everyday life. He holds an undergraduate degree from Bard College and a master's from Oxford, and has reported on issues like South Asian politics, security and terrorism for the Express Tribune, Al Jazeera, New York Times, and many others.
And our third panelist is Zahina Rashid from the Maldives, from MUWCI's class of 2006. Currently, she is a senior producer at Al Jazeera. Zahina has dedicated her career to speaking truths to power in fight for freedom, media freedom in the Maldives. She has covered higher sensitive issues, fought tirelessly for fair investigations into her colleagues' disappearances, and has been arrested in 2016 protest against the decline in media freedom. She was also the chief speaker at MUWCI's 2019 graduation, and we're so happy to have you back with us today.
So we're gonna move on to some basic questions that all the panelists will be answering. So the ability of journalists to report freely on matters of public interest is a crucial indicator of democracy. In your own individual context, how relevant is this statement?
would like to
Whoever
go?
like to
Yeah.
go first.
Okay, I don't mind starting. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be a part of this panel. So yeah, I guess I'm sure everyone would agree here that it is very crucial. It's at least in the Indian context, from what I'm seeing, is that there is no sort of two-way interaction. There's no flow of information from authorities to its people. There have been barely any press conferences addressed by our leaders and our ministers and even small bureaucrats. No one wants to answer any questions. So there is no sort of transparent flow of information. There's oppression of data, etc. So during this time, it's hard to believe that our elected representatives represent anything good, because it's so hard to ask them questions. So that sort of, I mean, that is a basic right that I believe every citizen in a democratic country should have, right? Just ask questions, hold them accountable. That's something we learn in all our political science notebooks, books growing up. So that's the basics of it. And at least in our country, we don't see that anymore. I feel like the freedom to ask questions is reducing by the day. So yeah, that would be my perspective on that.
I'll interject there as well. Hi, I'm Zahina. I'm from the Maldives, and I grew up in a dictatorship. So essentially, I had when I went to MUWCI was the first time that I realized my country was actually a dictatorship, and we'd had the same president for 25 years at that point. And it was in a global affairs discussion on the rise of the far right in Europe, in MUWCI, and that people were talking about political parties and so on. And I actually put up my hand and I said, you know, why do you even need political parties for democracy? The Maldives is a democracy and it doesn't have any political parties. And there was pin drop silence everywhere. So, and that was really the beginning of my political awareness. So when I came back after graduating, I took a gap year, and that was right at the time was when the Maldives was going through a period of political liberalization after riots because of torture in jail and so on. And I really I was so angry in some ways that I had been lied to, and just also so that you could grow up somewhere and not know any of the history and not know anything about what was going on, because all of our media was controlled by the state. We, like the newspapers, the news would actually be vetted by the president's office. We did have privately owned newspapers, but even their news would be vetted by the president's office. So that was part of the reason I really got involved in the democratic movement, reform movement here, by working for one of the first independent and critical newspapers. And it's been about, I guess, 2 decades since the beginning of the reform movement, and Maldivian democracy is still very much a work in progress. And we had a democratic elected government. That government was overthrown. We had a period of return to authoritarianism, and during that period I've lost colleagues of mine, a friend of mine, because of their work and what they were writing about. So it's just the fact, like, just the ability for people to speak, to debate, these are so important in terms of for them to be able to make decisions about their own lives and their own future. And this is, I'm talking about a very basic freedom, which I did not know growing up. And now it's so much more complex, because now we also have to talk about disinformation and, which is happening online now. So there's a lot to, I guess, to talk about here, but yeah, it's incredibly important that we have freedom of expression and speech for democracy.
So I've been a reporter in two countries, and they're very, very different. Belgium and Pakistan are not similar in any way. But I think the one thing that I can say about the difficulties of being a journalist in both is twin pressures on journalism as a business. One is from governments and countries, and the other one's from commercial interests. And I can give you an example of how both of those interests are essentially squeezing the work that journalists do. So I used to work at this newspaper called the Express Tribune in Karachi, in Pakistan, and I think both of those were things that I experienced. So one was there was an attack on the building where I was working at the time. So it was this big building with 5 floors, and so each floor was a different kind of media operation. So it was the same company. One floor was a TV channel, one floor was the Urdu newspaper, the other floor was the English newspaper. And there were guys that came on motorcycles, and they threw a couple of grenades in the building, and then they started shooting at the door. And we were inside, and we had absolutely no idea what was going on. Luckily, I guess, that was just a warning attack, so nobody was killed. But about a month later, there was a drive-by shooting on a van, a satellite van, and they killed the driver, the cameraman, and the journalists that were in the van. And so there was a very clear kind of message that we need to change the way we were reporting on militancy. And that was from the Taliban. And we had this surreal experience where on the TV channel, the spokesperson for the Taliban called in and said, yeah, that was us. And then the journalist was trying to negotiate with him on air, going like, okay, if we stop talking about you guys, will you stop killing us? And then he's like, well, yeah, I mean, we'll think about it. It really depends on how you cover us. And so that's one form, and I guess a more obvious, more clear form of the kind of pressures that journalists are under, at least in a place like Pakistan. But the other one is actually, I think, far more interesting, and I think less talked about, which is that the newspaper is owned by a big industrial family that have a lot of other commercial interests in the country, which includes the McDonald's franchise in Pakistan. And one of the things that we started doing was we would wrap up the newspaper around midnight, and then we'd send it to the presses, and then they'd add the ads after. But we'd always leave these blank spaces where the ads were supposed to go. And so the next morning, we'd look at the newspaper, and there were these hit pieces on Burger King, which was just opening in Pakistan. And so there'd be like stories about how their meat is tainted and how nobody's showing up, and like they've bungled their opening and everything. So along with like this sort of very, almost epic, heroic take that we were taking on, hey, the Taliban are killing us, the government's killing us, we were also just a side piece for the McDonald's franchise in Pakistan, talking about how every other burger outlet is horrible. And I think to an extent, I mean, those are extreme cases of a place like Pakistan, but I think to an extent that is also the case everywhere else. I think the big change that has happened since the internet is that journalism just doesn't pay or doesn't have the power that it used to. And it's at the behest of either governments being charitable or having sugar daddies like Jeff Bezos take over. And neither of them is necessarily good for journalism. And I think that's a much bigger problem, and that's a more systemic issue, where either you need to come up with a model, and it just doesn't exist really, where one can be self-sufficient and powerful, or you need to have a sugar daddy. And I think if journalism is in a state where that is what you're relying on to ensure that you can continue doing your work, then things are very, very scary.
Thank you for that. That was all so interesting. I love the McDonald's part, I have to say.
Yeah, and I like how when we hear these stories about how your building was attacked, we're just in shock. But then the rest of the people in the panelists, they're like, oh, yeah, normal.
Just
happens.
a regular Thursday. Yeah.
So the other question we had was, considering the threat on journalism recently, what keeps you going in times like these? Like knowing that there's such a big risk factor, what keeps you motivated?
I think for me, it's just the right to know is just such a fundamental part of, I believe it's just such a fundamental part of being human. And it's, I mean, in the Maldives, it was also, and it's so linked to just your ability to make to make decisions about who governs you, about the kind of policies that you're subject to, about the the kind of life that you can have. And I do think getting information out there is important so that people know what's happening. And I mean, in the Maldives, especially in the circumstances that I was working in, it was, it really did matter that people knew about the corruption cases that was happening, that people knew about what was happening in the jails, and that people knew what was happening, within the military and the police, and it really did make a difference in many ways. For example, in 2018, when people we had an election where the Maldivian people resoundingly, voted to remove the former government, which has been accused of corruption, one of the biggest cases of corruption in the Maldives, and also of inaction in the disappearance of a colleague of mine and the killing of a friend of mine. And so, and when surveys do show that the outrage at corruption and the outrage at the abuses of power did tip the election. So I think, I mean, not every day is like that in journalism, not every period is like that, but like it really, I do believe in putting out information out there so that people can make the decisions that's right for themselves. And it's, and I think that's really what keeps me going. That, I mean, people I don't necessarily have, huge faith in humanity that they would, that everything, just putting a story out there will make people act in the right way. But like, if enough people know, there is the possibility for really incredible change. And just that the possibility exists is, I think, why I do this job.
Yeah, and I also completely agree with what Zahina is saying. I mean, the moments that I do feel a little like, why am I doing this, which happens all the time. It's just been 3 years of me working as a full-time journalist in India, but I guess it's just been increasingly really bad in the past 1 or 2 years. I feel like everyone feels the pressure more than ever. Or maybe that's just my perspective. I don't know how it worked before this. And there are moments where I'm like, why am I doing this? I'm getting nothing out of this. I'm not getting money. I'm not getting any stability. It's just like so stressful. There's no validation. There's nothing apart from the fact that you think you're doing something bigger than you. And I know it sounds really cheesy, but it's kind of what Zaina was saying that does keep me going. But there are moments where, I mean, it's not even that, at least from my perspective, it's not just been moments where directly something has happened or, I mean, I'm lucky enough that I've been safe till now in that way, but there's this sort of sense of surveillance that you already start feeling. At least that's how I'm feeling right now. There are moments where my funding is not coming in, or maybe the government raised some questions about the money coming into my bank, or me being told I randomly would meet some tech bro working for the government and he'd tell me, hey, we know what you're doing, watch your back and stuff like that, which is so insidious. And they say things like that, and it just gets to your head. You just have this kind of annoying fear, not knowing what's going to happen. But then after that, you get over that and you're like, I mean, you just can't live with that fear. You've got to do your work. If it happens, it happens. But I mean, maybe have some kind of plan, lawyer up or something like that. But beyond that, you can't live like that. So I think that's the kind of seesaw thinking that I go through every day.
There's this joke that circulates amongst journalists where you go like, well, the shitty thing about being a journalist is that you don't make any money, but on the other hand, everyone hates you. So it's really kind of hard to find reasons to be doing this. And Chahat is right. Like sometimes you just have to dig really to find it. And for some also they don't find it, right? There's so many people that hop from journalism into PR or consulting or lobbying or whatever. For me, honestly, one of the things that really keeps me in this is it's fun. It's just really fun. And sometimes you just realize that you wrote a story that you're happy about, that you edited a story that's really cool, and you're glad that it's out there, and you're glad somebody worked on it, and you're glad that people are reading it. So I mean, there's also a joy to it. It's not a sacrificial job, really. Like it's not something that you do, holding your nose. It's something that's fun. And you talk to people, you hear their stories, and sometimes it's an immense privilege to tell people's stories because they wouldn't be doing it themselves. To know a lot about something that most people don't know about, and trying to make it interesting and trying to get other people to be like, hey, this is something you should know about. So it's just also a fun thing to do. And I think in times when the kind of effect that you want on society isn't happening, or the kind of change that you want, or if your government's still shit, then those are the times where you realize, well, I mean, I'm also doing this for me, right? Like, and I think that's kind of important to be aware of, and that's I think what keeps me going, because honestly there's not much else I'd rather be doing, because it's just great.
I absolutely agree. It is for me, especially, when I really get into writing something, there is this sense of losing time. And I also think journalism is one of those jobs where you really do get to speak to everyone. Like you can talk to the president of a country, and you can talk to, normal, ordinary people, and just this, and that's such a powerful feeling as well. I think that you are exercising, that you can go to any press conference and ask any question, and you can grill anybody about anything just because you're a journalist, and it is really fun. Definitely.
Thank you for your responses. That was so inspiring to hear, because like the things that we know that journalists go through, and then despite knowing all that, knowing the danger that you guys live through every single day, and then still like working hard, it's so inspiring to me. We just had another question. What is your personal favorite from amongst the articles that you've worked on, and why? And if you like whatever you're talking about, if it's available in the form of a link, please share that in the chat. Anyone can go.
Okay, so I think the biggest impact piece of work that I did was a documentary about the corruption in government, and it was called Steel in Paradise, and it's essentially about how the Maldivian government leased all these islands. The Maldives is really famous for its tourism, so it essentially these islands are worth tens of millions of dollars. So what the government of the day was doing was they were and you're supposed to open a bidding process before you lease out these islands, but that government was just giving out these islands to their cronies, and then taking this money and then using it to buy judges and parliamentarians, and committing all kinds of abuses of power. And I had to leave the country because of that documentary, and I couldn't come back for about 2 years until the change in government, actually. So, but it was, I worked with Al Jazeera on that one, and it was really interesting because we actually had our main source for that documentary was a former vice president's mobile phones. So we actually got all the data from a data leak from 2 mobile phones he had at the time. So we had access to all these text messages between him and businessmen, and him and judges, him and parliamentarians, as well as him and also members of, watchdog bodies like the Anti-Corruption Commission, who was supposed to investigate these abuses of power, but were in fact working with the vice president. So that was just such, and I think a very unique, something that doesn't happen very often, that you could get access to someone's personal mobile phones, especially someone who was who had such a high position. So that was really fun, even though the consequences weren't great. Personally for me, but I think it had a really high impact. I'll put the link in the chat here.
I'd be very interested in having a look at that. That sounds incredible. And yeah, sorry that you had to pay for it so much though. That sounds like a very stressful thing. So the article that I shared is the article that actually set me on journalism, really. I was a college student, and one of the things that I think had been stuck in my head since I've been at MUWCI was thinking about what it meant to be a Pakistani in India, and I just thought that the entire experience was so surreal. And one of the places where it was the most surreal was at the Wagah border. So this was actually, I don't know if you guys still call it like Project Week, but yeah, I guess we went on this trip, and I was with two friends of mine, and we were in Punjab, and we were going up, and I decided to check out the border ceremony that takes place from the Indian side as a Pakistani. And that was just crazy because, Pakistan home, I guess, was right across. And then there's just this entire stadium of people that were yelling at the other side. And then they had hired a person to get them to yell even louder and to just get them into a frenzy. And yeah, it just was, I figured that if they'd actually spotted somebody who they thought was Pakistani there, they would have just lynched them or something, because they were just getting more and more worked up. And then the thing is, I'd been from the other side when I was like 14 or something as like a school field trip, and we were doing the same thing. And the whole thing just seemed bizarre. Like two people that were using the same language to insult each other, and, looked exactly the same, and were like, sitting on charpais and drinking lassi and having butter chicken, were just all of a sudden really, really upset with each other for reasons that I still couldn't understand. And so I decided to write about it, and without actually knowing anybody, without doing anything, I just kind of sent it to opinion@newyorktimes.com, and then for some reason they published it 3 days later. And I just kind of thought, okay, that was, I think, really great because it made me realize that this is interesting, not just for me, that I think other people might be interested in talking about it, thinking about it. And also that I might be good at it, and so the idea that, okay, this is something that I want to write about, and this is something that I could get better at doing, and that other people might be interesting, is actually what got me into this. So that's why I'm kind of, and I think it was so, on a separate context, I think it was just so fundamentally related to my MUWCI experience that I think I could draw like a direct line to being at MUWCI to who I am today. And in that sense, I think it's something that's very close to my heart, because I don't think I would have had that kind of experience had I not gone and thought about this stuff. And then I was just like, look, I just want to do some more thinking about this, and I want to write some more, and I want to tell people like this shit's insane, and like other people need to be thinking about how insane this is. So that's so that's the one that I think, at least for this discussion, is a bit more relevant.
Yeah, I mean, I totally understand how surreal that feels. I've gone through the same experience, and I've always thought like I need to articulate something here, and felt like that's crazy. The Wagah border experience is absolutely nuts. So I'm excited to read that. For me, I mean, sadly, these are more like morbid stories, but I think the most impactful one for me was the cover story I did for the Caravan, which was on the second wave of the pandemic, and just tracing down how institutions failed. How institutions failed in preventing that second wave, and how lives could have been saved if our government had acted on time. So that was a very interesting exercise. That was the kind of first long form story that I'd done, at least of that length. So I was really excited about just piecing that narrative together. It was not just the reporting bit, but trying my hand at just understanding how that works, like trying to put things in, making it a little literary, even though this is like very morbid ground reportage that I had to weave together, but then also trying to kind of bring something larger out of it. And I had to do it in the span of 15, 20 days. So it was quite stressful. It was right after all my ground reporting during the second wave. I had been traveling everywhere, just basically looking at crematoria and hospitals. So it wasn't like I was feeling very inspired, but yeah, I think it was a great opportunity, and just trying to, and then to quickly get that skill of making sources high up talk and like reveal facts and sketch those characters of the government figures involved. So all of those, that exercise that you have in a journalism class where your teachers tell you, yeah, get those characters, build, like fortify it with this information. Why does this matter? Like, what is bringing the narrative together? So I felt like that exercise could be put into practice finally for me. So I think that was one of the more memorable pieces that I did. I'll attach the link as well.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting to hear. And I can't wait to watch the video that we're going to watch about Al Jazeera. So now we had a few like individual questions. And so the first one was for Saim. We know that you spent a significant time in India before you started working at the Express Tribune in Pakistan. Reflecting on it now, how would you describe the differences in media environments here and in Pakistan? How does the conflict between the two countries play out in that landscape?
Unfortunately, I think it's looking more and more similar. And I think 15 years ago, that wasn't the case when I was in India. I think it's messy, huh? Like it's super messy. I think one of the things that it goes back to what I was saying regarding that the two towers of commercial interests and government interests, and I think those have become increasingly aligned for both countries. In fact, I think one of the things that made the right wing of Pakistan really happy was when the right wing of India was elected, because then they could point to India and talk about how awful it was as awful as their imaginations thought it would be. And I think the same kind of thing started happening in India, because I was actually working at I don't know if it's defunct anymore or not, but I'm a bit embarrassed to tell people this at the time now, because I used to work at a magazine called Tehelka in Delhi in 2012, and then a bunch of shit happened, and then I think I was there before that shit happened, and we don't need to go into that. But anyway, what was really interesting about then was how I got a very sort of uncut look into what people were thinking about Pakistan in India. And that seemed to be as scary as the way Pakistanis were thinking about India. And I think that media environment is becoming more and more similar, where there's less and less space for dissenting voices, and just on a very basic level for peace. Huh? Like I think it's just harder and harder to make an argument for normalization. It's harder and harder. Because I think in both sides it's become a bit of a bogeyman. Every time there's anything that happens in Pakistan, somebody blames, they're Indian agents. And I think Chahat obviously would know better about this. The context in which Pakistan is used when it comes to Indian politics is also kind of similar, where anybody says anything they don't like about the Indian government and they tell them to go to Pakistan. So it's I think both sides are using the other as a bogeyman, and at the same time deriving a lot of advantage out of it, because it's useful to imagine India as like a malevolent, harmful thing. I mean, it's the entire reason the Pakistani army exists today as it does. And I think the same is becoming increasingly true of India, where Pakistan has become this bogeyman, and it's easier to point to a lot of issues. It's easier to point to Pakistan instead of working hard on a lot of issues that might still have a lot to do with the way India is. And I think Kashmir is a very good example, especially over what happened with the constitutional crisis and the lockdowns and the stuff that happened there. And I think the commercial interests, I really do want to emphasize this, is because it's easier to point to like horrible governments that do this, but the thing is that there's a lot of money to be made buy people to do this. And a lot of these interests have a lot to do with it. And it's really scary because I'll give you an example. There's a newspaper called Dawn in Pakistan, and it's the newspaper of record. It's a very good newspaper, independent, and they ran this story, and it was against the government because it was talking about the very difficult relations that take place between the Pakistani military and the Pakistani government. And then after that, the newspaper got screwed. They essentially told everybody to stop to stop advertising in the newspaper. Now, Pakistan's media system is still rudimentary enough that you don't really have online subscriptions, you don't really have online advertising as much. So they're still very much counting on the print newspaper, and they're still very much counting on advertising money from the print newspaper. And so overnight, about 60% of all its money just stopped. And that's how they did it. It wasn't literal censorship. It wasn't somebody giving them a phone call saying you can't publish this. It just meant that they stopped the money coming in, because a lot of other companies were as keen to make sure that the government that the military is happy enough. And so, whether they're advertising mattresses or condoms or whatever it is, I mean, that money also stopped coming in. And so those are the kind of commercial interests that are also very much intricately involved in the way journalism works. And that's how you can operate it. So ostensibly, you can talk about a free media with government saying, look, we don't censor, we haven't shot anybody, we haven't disappeared anybody. But at the same time, at least in practical terms, the newspaper can't function. So Dawn, for example, had to lay off a whole bunch of people, had to work on, just a skeleton staff, and couldn't do the kind of journalism that it was doing. And that, I think, is this erosion of norms that I'm scared might happen in India too. And in that sense, I would feel that that's a very scary thing, and happening without even the presence of a force like the Pakistani military specifically, because obviously that doesn't play the same role in India. And I can tell you that at least 15 years ago, when I was in India, to me, it was something I looked up to. I just figured, okay, well, India is like Pakistan, but less crazy. And now I think I'm a bit scared where I don't know whether I can still say the same thing. So that would be my view. But of course, I think Chahat would have a lot more to say about that. This is just something from my experiences that I've seen in India, and some of the things that I've come to notice about how the Indian media landscape is developing.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to agree with you about the dynamic that exists in India about Pakistan, or in Pakistan about India, because I come from a military background. So there's a lot of things you hear that I was in the military, now we left. So after you leave, you see a lot more of the opinion that exists in the country overall, instead of what the military thinks about a country. And it was really it was an eye-opening experience for me.
The next question we have is for Zahina. We read about your experience of being in jail early in 2016 for protesting against the abuse of the press. Could you tell us a bit about that experience and also for reflecting on it now? Would you say conditions have gotten better in the Maldives for journalists?
So that was April. April a couple of years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. No, sorry, 6 years ago. So about 19 of us 19 journalists were arrested from outside the president's office. And we had been protesting because it had been years of abuses against the press. So a colleague of mine was disappeared. There were attacks on TV stations. So, entire places just being burnt to the ground. Other murder attempts and stabbings, death threats. So that at that time, death threats were really just a normal part of our lives. And then the government would just refuse to investigate any of these cases. But the Maldivian press was really, I'm really proud of my colleagues here. People really didn't give up and continued to report. But then what the government started doing was, because and all of these attacks were happening through government-linked gangs, but they couldn't really silence the press. So by using all these all these other measures. So they actually started resorting to the law. So they introduced a law criminalizing defamation. So that meant that you could go to jail, you could, for years, you could be fined in exorbitant amounts, and your newspaper could also be shut down. So they did that. And then they also, they started leaning on businessmen who own newspapers to shut down certain papers. So one paper was shut down with the president personally calling the businessman and telling him to shut it down. And the second one, where they had the courts involved, and the courts essentially just shut down the biggest newspaper in the country. So it was years of frustration, and I think journalists like representing nearly every major outlet in the country, and most of us were young. We were not, we weren't the most experienced, older journalists. So we all protested outside the president's office, and 19 of us were arrested. Fortunately, we weren't held for that long, so about 10 hours, and so it wasn't, I mean, we were held in this really squalid cell in Male and subjected to strip searches, but we got out, and I mean, right now it's very, very different. It's just amazing how just the change in the attitudes of the people in power is the difference between, physical, like actual physical threats to your safety, and just being able to speak your mind. And obviously, there's lots of issues in the Maldivian press, and some of the things that Saim was saying as well, about all the newspapers and media outlets being owned by certain businesses. So which means you get all owned by political parties, so you only get their views. But the good thing is it's really vibrant. So if you want to hear a particular view, it's still available. So it's very different to what it was now, and it really does matter. And it changed overnight. Like for me, I couldn't walk down the street a couple of years ago without being paranoid about getting attacked. And it's just this feeling of, first of all, to be able to be back with my family in my home country, and also being able to walk down the street without the fear of getting attacked. It's amazing. So yeah, it's changed a lot, but there's so much that needs to be done in terms of justice for past crimes against journalists, in terms of the ownership models, and yeah, but things have changed. It's good.
So much. That sounds so scary. Yeah. So Chahat, we read about your work regarding custodial rape last year in January. What was your experience dealing with authorities working on a case which accused them?
Yeah, so that was a story that took some time. It's always hard to chase down authorities for any kind of answer, for any kind of story. Honestly, they're not even the ones which are very, which reveal something new or anything that might even, anything explosive. So they're generally not ready to speak to the journalists at all for any story, for anything, for any query. So this was, of course, a little harder. It was quite a goose chase. I had to try and track down these policemen who were involved, who were named in the FIR by the minor Dalit woman who was allegedly raped in custody. So that was quite a tricky story. It took a lot of time because I had to figure out a lot of the legalese and look at the court documents and look at what's happening, because she was also accused of the murder of a policeman, and that's something that allows them to do a lot with impunity, right? Like, because there's so much outrage around that. So it was very hard. It took like speaking to one policeman to another, like it took a few months. But I think the major thing is it's not that hard to get to people who are on the ground, maybe like, policemen who are lower down the ranks. They will still, because and that is also something morally I feel a little scared of negotiating, because I'm like, they don't know what's happening a lot of the times. They don't know what they're talking about. I feel like they don't have that awareness of how to tackle the press, etc. And even if they are someone who have committed a horrendous crime, I feel like they have the right to understand what kind of who they're speaking to and how this will be used. So sort of negotiating that power, that you're speaking to someone from a police station somewhere in Haryana, they don't know what's happening, they don't know what magazine I write for, and they will just, so I feel like they don't have that kind of understanding, and I always have to negotiate that power dynamic while speaking to them. The worst thing is the people above, like people who have senior police officials, even women who were responsible for the committees that were looking into this after there was some press coverage on the matter, who completely avoid your questions, who don't see this as a problem at all, who know what's happening on the ground and are accountable, but are very ready to throw other people under the bus and get away with it. It's not like they don't know what's happening. They can do whatever they need to stop that. So yeah, I mean, it's always hard to chase authorities down. There's a lot of deflection happening. There's a lot of casteism, and like you hear very, very horrible things. And but yeah, I think the interesting part of that is negotiating how to deal with people across hierarchy and understanding where do you place accountability, and how do you represent people and their statements according to where they are on that hierarchy. So I think that is also a lesson that I kind of tried to learn through that story. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that entire story with us. I imagine it'd be extremely difficult to even get anything out of the authorities regarding such a sensitive issue, especially in the subcontinent. Now we wanted to actually go to the next segment where we open up the questions from the audience. And the first question we have is from someone named Vivor. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. They actually said it'd be helpful to hear about the commitments of our current and aspiring journalists / mass media professionals to conveying facts of people rather than engaging in persuading people or actually forming opinions for the populace. So essentially they're asking if is conveying facts more important, or is giving news that would entice the audience and get more viewership more important?
So I think there's a misconception that being a journalist or the news is only supposed to deliver facts. It's a reason why a lot of newspapers have opinion columns. It's a reason why they have editorials, and it's a reason why you subscribe to a particular newspaper for a particular political outlook. And I don't think that in itself is necessarily a bad thing at all, actually, because on top of, in fact, it's easier to tell people there was an explosion somewhere. It's a lot harder to tell people what it means or why it happened and what should happen as a result. And that is also our job. So, because I think there's a lot more to a story than the facts. And I think as long as we do that honestly, we're doing a good job by telling or like highlighting exactly where we stand on a particular issue and why we think this is important. So when it comes to a newspaper that endorses a particular candidate in an election, for example, that isn't bad, because they're saying this is what we're doing. The problem that you have is when you try to present fact as opinion, and when there's a certain amount of deception involved in doing that. I personally have absolutely no problem with Fox News being right wing. It's a problem when they say we are fair and balanced. And I think that's a far more problematic assertion, which, good for them, they stopped at some point, because come on. So I would only say that as long as you label what you're actually doing, it's okay. And as long as you're transparent about what it is. The other problem that actually ends up becoming far more problematic is when all views are not represented. So if you have a country where so much, or that the viewpoint or the editorial outlook of the newspaper is influenced by its owners, then you have a much bigger problem. I think climate change in the US is a very good example, where there was so much attention paid to climate skepticism, or when it comes to the amount of coverage that the French media gave to the right wing, for example, recently. I think that's where it becomes a problem, where either the attention itself is not directly correlated to a pluralistic media environment, or that coverage itself is rigged due to interests that aren't necessarily representative of the newspaper or the country. So, I mean, I don't think that there's any such thing required as balance between the two. Huh? Like, it really, it's a question of what your newspaper is out to do. You have intellectual journals like, the London Review of Books or the New York Review of Books, that their job isn't to report news, but to have very smart people write very smart things about stuff that's happening now. So I wouldn't make this division between opinion and news, which I think a lot of people kind of assume is they take for granted. I just want people to be less deceptive about it and to understand why there is an opinion, and to label it when it is.
So much for that. In the interest of time, we're going to be moving on to the next question. It's from Zephyr. As Al Jazeera was accused of being a tool for Qatar's government and some terrorist recognized groups' propaganda, how do you feel about working for such a corporation? Do you even take into consideration the newspaper or media's ideology that you're applying to work for?
Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Do you even take into consideration the newspaper or the media's ideology that you're applying to work for?
I really will push back against Al Jazeera English's, this accusation against Al Jazeera English. We cover the world. And I mean, just from my personal experience, I can tell you, no media organization actually, so when we received all of the text messages from the former vice president's phone about all these incredible abuses of power that were happening in the Maldives. No major news organization, and we reached out to several of them, actually took this story because the Maldives is such a small place. But Al Jazeera did, and they poured significant amount of money into it, and they've done and I believe the documentary is incredible. They've done a really good job with it. And Al Jazeera, for example, I think it's viewed differently in different places. So, for example, I think our African audience thinks it's a really it's a very good TV channel because it really does cover parts of the global south that other major outlets which are Western owned don't. And in that way, I'm really proud of the channel for the work they do. But I do acknowledge that, there has been that criticism, especially leveled at the other arms of the organization. But I'm not a representative of Al Jazeera at this panel. And I would say in my personal experience with the work at Al Jazeera that I do and that my team does is incredible. And we really try to cover stories that many people, many Western media organizations don't. And I'm proud of that.
I'll just add just one little thing that I actually freelanced for Al Jazeera a couple of times when I was in Pakistan, including a story on evaporating media freedoms for Pakistani journalists. And Al Jazeera were not only very generous, but I mean, the fact that this is an interesting story that they were interested in is also, I think, worth mentioning. So yeah, I would agree in that we can talk about the Qatari government and the company's relationship to that, but in other parts of the world, I think they do essential work.
Thank you so much for that. Now we will be opening up questions for the greater audience. So anyone can raise their hand and we can call on them and they can ask any questions they want. Yeah, Hida.
Hi, so I haven't necessarily formulated a question yet, but I wanted to reach out to Zahina and say that, hi, I'm from the Maldives as well. I wanted to thank you for all the work that you've done. Right, I think even though I wasn't there to see the dictatorship that you were mentioning, I think I saw say Stealing Paradise and other work that like Maldivian journalists have done, like help like the Maldivian people realize the agency that they have. And I think that's like such like a really cool thing that I think especially people in the Maldives like really, really needed. And so I guess I wanted to ask like where you see specifically, I guess, Maldivian journalism like going from now, because I feel like, at least for me, Stealing Paradise and like the say the disappearance of your colleagues and like the very sadly like the murder of other journalists, I think that like kind of sparked more importance in journalism, if that makes sense. Like it's become like, say, things that me and other like Maldivian peers have become more interested in. It's definitely something that I want to pursue. And like seeing how impactful it's been in the Maldives, like I don't know, advice, or where do you see Maldivian journalism going henceforth?
Well, what I really like about the Maldivian media landscape is that it's very vibrant. There's so many different news outlets, and I mean, even though neither one is, you know, or not one per newspaper is essentially gets everything right, but like I like the fact that there's so many of them, and you can really get a really broad idea of what's happening in the Maldives. What scares me most though is that even though, you know, I no longer feel any physical threats to my safety, none of the cases of crimes, violence against journalists have been investigated and brought to justice. So my big fear is that, you know, it really literally, it only takes a change in government. It really only takes a change in the politicians governing the country for this to become our reality again. And I think as long as there's no justice, this impunity exists. And that's something that worries me.
Thank you so much for that. Are there any other questions? Okay, so we would like to pass it on to Monica ji and Anga ji. Thank you so much.
And then you may go.
Okay, great. Thanks, Monica. Right, I think we've come to the end of our discussion. It's 7:30 IST at least. Just wanted to thank everybody that tuned in for this. It's so nice that we have days like World Press Freedom Day or the multiple other days we celebrate, because it gives us an excuse to come together and engage in some healthy discussions. So thank you so much to Chahat, Saim, Zahina again, of course, Vani and Amani for volunteering to do this. Most of all, Ninad, who's rarely in the spotlight, but without whom none of this could be possible, for organizing this today. And of course, our lovely audience for showing up and participating. I'll hand over to Monica perhaps for just a last closing remark before we let you all go. Have a lovely evening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Saim, Zahina, and Chahat. It was really a wonderful, realistic session, because what I have been taking in the class, as I said, always talking about journalists, that what they do, how you have to write the report. But today, I mean, they encountered with journalists. So this was something wow moment. I hope that all of my students, they enjoyed this session, and thanks for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.